No, just mine.
A Sunday school teacher posed a question to our class. She said, listen, if I sell my house, if I sell my car, if I donate all my possessions to charity and give a whole bunch of money to the church, will I go to heaven? And the children unanimously turned around and said, no. So she was a little shocked at that. So she says, okay, let me ask you this. If I was to keep our building nice and clean, if I was to cut the grass and keep everything neat and tidy, would I get into heaven? And once again, all the kids unanimously said, no. And so she was really confused at this. So she turned to the kids and said, how can I get into heaven then? And one little smart little boy, who was about 5 years old, turned around and said, you have to be dead first. We're living in a world where technology is going bananas with AI and things. We were speaking about this not long ago with Tom and Sydney. And facial recognition is everywhere. Biometrics is on your phone. You know, if you want to make bank transfers and all this sort of stuff. It's just everywhere, isn't it? And I was asked by our dear sister here to deal with a question. Will we recognise each other in heaven? It's quite a popular question, actually. I couldn't believe how popular it was, but it's popular. So we're going to try and go ahead and try and address this. But we are so blessed today to have what we call the Bible, the full revelation from God. Because if we just had the Old Testament, let me say something, we're going to have a lot more questions than we would have answers if you just had the Old Testament on its own. And so when it comes to the Old Testament, it shouldn't be any surprise to us that for many of the Hebrews, they had no clear teaching about the future, about the afterlife, whether for good people or for bad people. In fact, as we text Stephen kindly read out earlier, it's not until Jesus comes along in the New Testament that brought death and immortality to light. In other words, he moved away all the mist, all the fog concerning the afterlife. Jesus is the one who did that. But just because there's no specific teaching in the Old Testament about the afterlife doesn't mean it didn't exist. It simply means there's no clear teaching about the afterlife in the Old Testament. So for example, Solomon says, for the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing. They have no future reward, and even the name is forgotten. Well, that's quite encouraging, isn't it? They never considered life after death as a possibility, and as far as they were concerned, the Hebrews thought that death, grave, was the end. The grave, that was the end of it, as far as they understood. We get a glimpse of this in 2 Samuel chapter 11 and 12. Remember we dealt with this in a Bible study a few weeks ago on a Wednesday evening. We saw here that David committed adultery with Bathsheba. We read that she gets pregnant. Unfortunately, the child dies. But David says, can I bring him back again? Well, the answer to that is, no, you can't, David. God is the only one that can do that. Well, I will go to him, but he will not return to me. So when David uses these words, I will go to him, he's implying that he understands that his son is somewhere and he's going to see him again. And so that would have brought a lot of comfort to David and Bathsheba, even though they didn't have a clear understanding of the afterlife. That would have brought some comfort to them. But like I said, it's not until you come to the New Testament you get a clear understanding of the afterlife. For example, I'm not going to read all this, but we know the story really well with the Mount of Transfiguration. We read that Jesus is being transfigured before them. And there appears as Elijah and a Moses alongside Jesus. Now remember, Elijah hadn't died, he'd been taken up to heaven. Moses, well, he's been dead for centuries now at this point in time. He's been long gone. But it's clear the disciples recognize Elijah and Moses. In fact, Peter himself names them and offers to build 3 shelters. So, if that tells me anything, it implies that Peter, James and John recognised Elijah and Moses in their spiritual bodies, and if they recognise them in their spiritual bodies, that implies to me they're going to recognise them in heaven. It's going to have the same, nothing's going to change there. One of the most compelling arguments for recognition in the afterlife is found in the story of the rich man and Lazarus in Luke chapter 16. Again, we're not going to read this because we should be pretty familiar with it. But notice that both of them are absolutely aware of where they are. Lazarus was at Abraham's side. That's a Hebraism for heaven. It's the paradise of God, the third heaven. And the rich man, well, he's in hell. He's in Hades. And the rich man recognises Abraham, even though Abraham has been dead for years. But he recognises him and calls out to Abraham. He also recognises Lazarus. Remember, this is in the afterlife. So there's recognition there of something that's going on. And verse 27, 28 tells us that he remembered he had a family, and he remembered he's got 5 brothers. Now when you put this together and think about it, Abraham would hardly ask the rich man to remember what he received in his life during his lifetime, and remember what Lazarus had received in his lifetime. He wouldn't ask him to remember if he wasn't capable of remembering. So there's facial recognition, and there's a memory of people who've been involved in our lives. That seems to come across pretty clear. And so those who die have got a memory of themselves. They've got a memory of others. They've even got a memory, or they seem to know people who've been dead for a long time, like Abraham. He seems to know that. And they're aware of where they are. And then we move on to the judgment day, where we find Jesus saying some interesting things concerning the sheep and the goats in the parable in Matthew chapter 5. Now notice here that Jesus says to those on his right that they fed him, they gave him something to drink, invited him into their homes, clothed him, looked after him when he was sick, and even visited him in prison. Now here's the interesting part. In verse 37 to 39, notice that those he's addressing had no idea what Jesus was talking about. They've got no idea what he's talking about. They couldn't remember anything they did for Jesus. But remember the idea behind the parable. Jesus tells them that when they cared for other Christians, they were actually caring for him. Now why is this important? I think it's important because it seems to imply, to me at least, that even though they didn't know they were actually serving Jesus while they were on earth, in heaven they would remember. They would remember those they'd been serving, in other words, other Christians. Otherwise, how can they be judged if they can't remember what they've done or who they've helped? So there has to be recognition there, in some shape or form. In the book of Revelation, chapter 6, through to 9 to 10, notice those in heaven. They're in the throne room of God, and these are Christians who were killed because of their faith. And notice they're absolutely fully aware of where they are. Yeah, they're aware of that. They remember that they've been murdered, and they're aware of those who murdered them, and they're aware that those who murdered them hadn't been punished yet. Does that not imply that they remember? Does that not imply there'll be some kind of recognition when we get to heaven? And remember this also. In Romans 14:10 and 2 Corinthians 5:10, both speaking about Christians concerning Judgment Day. So these are written to Christians for Christians. And when you think about it, how can Christians appear before the great judgment seat of Christ and be held accountable for the things they've done in the body if we can't remember what we've done? That wouldn't make sense. How can we be held accountable for saying something to somebody if we don't know who that person is and we can't remember who that person is? Or the deeds that we've done. See, this is all piling up to say that we're going to recognise each other in heaven. We're going to recognise and remember those that we've said things and done things that we shouldn't have said and shouldn't have done, and on and on and on. So there's a recognition going on there. And when you go to chapter 20, you see the same thing again. I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and the books were open. Another book was open, which is the book of life. Notice, the dead were judged according to what they had done as recorded in the books. The sea gave up the dead, and all that was in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead, and what were in them. And each person was judged according to what they had done. We cannot be judged for something if we can't remember what we've done. There has to be a recognition there of not only the things we've done, but the things that we've said. And the way we've treated people, whether they're Christians or not Christians. All of that comes in. And so when you put the whole package together, it seems clear to me that we're going to have some kind of recognition and remembrance when we get to heaven. In fact, Luke 13:28, Jesus says, you're going to meet Abraham, you're going to meet Isaac, and you're going to meet Jacob. You're going to meet all the prophets in the kingdom of God. And he makes it very clear by mentioning their names that somehow we're going to recognize them. And remember, people in heaven are not going to go around with name tags. Yeah. Hi, my name is Samuel. Remember me? I was a prophet in the Old Testament. There's not going to be name tags. There's something happening in our minds when we get up there that God opens all that up, where we recognize each other, we recognize other people, and we remember all the things we've done. Jesus, 1 John 3:2 and Revelation 22:4 tells us that we're going to see Jesus in all of his glory. We're going to see the Father in all of his glory. And so, if that's going to happen, then it stands to reason that we're going to see and recognize each other in heaven, in our new glorious bodies. If Jesus was recognizable after his resurrection, then surely we're going to be recognizable after our resurrection. Common sense has to rule there. And so yes, Jesus' body was different when he rose from the grave. It was now glorious, but people still recognized him. They still recognized who he was. And so yes, when we meet our loved ones in heaven, their bodies are going to be brand spanking new. But we will recognize them. We will know who they are, and they will recognize us. So what does all that mean for us today? Well, one of my favourite films that Russell and I chat about quite a lot is Gladiator. And in the film Gladiator, Maximus' wife and his son had been absolutely brutally murdered by the Romans, by the Roman elite. And later in the film, he's speaking to his friend who's a slave. And he tells him that my wife and my son are waiting for him in the afterlife. And the slave turns around and says these words, "You will meet them again, but not yet." Not yet. What's implying here is that we can fully enjoy life right now, knowing that we will be united with our loved ones again in heaven. We will see them again, but not yet. God has got work for us to be getting on with in the meantime. There was this old lady who left England in one of these old ships to go to America to visit one of her daughters. After a week at sea, a massive storm brewed up. And it was really bad, and everybody was panicking and really getting scared. So they decided they were going to get together and pray together. And as they were praying together, they noticed that one elderly lady was not panicking. She seemed calm right through the whole thing. And it puzzled them. And so when the storm finally calmed down, they asked her, "Why are you so calm? How are you so calm through this whole storm? And here's what she says. My dear friends, it's like this. I have 2 daughters. One died and went to heaven, and the other lives in America. When the storm arose, I wondered which one of them I might see first, the one in America or the one in heaven. And I just left it to the Lord, for I'd be glad to see either. That's very powerful, isn't it? Here's a woman who's totally convicted, absolutely convicted, that she will not only see her daughter, but recognise her daughter. And her daughter will recognise her. Isn't that a beautiful picture? Job was one of the richest men in the Bible. Numerous possessions. 7 sons, 3 daughters, and then God, through Satan, takes everything away. Everything is gone. But you have to keep reading on, as we did with the young adults when we were looking at Job. You have to keep reading on to get to the end of the book, and you read this. The Lord blessed the latter part of Job's life and more than the former part. He had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 donkeys. And he also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. So when you get to the end of the book of Acts, you see that God had blessed this godly man and gives him twice as much as everything he had before. And he gives him 7 sons and 3 daughters. The question is, well, why didn't God double his children? Why didn't God double his children like he doubled everything else? Why didn't he get 20 kids? Well, the answer is quite simple. He had 20 kids. He had 20 children. God did double his children. He had 10 in heaven and 10 on earth. And he knew that. He probably understood that. Job is going to have 20 children forever. And so he's going to meet them in heaven. They will recognize him in heaven, and his children will recognize him. And when we read over to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, and if you remember that it's pretty clear that Paul is trying to comfort some of the Christians in Thessalonica who are grieving over their lost ones, and they're thinking, am I ever going to see them again? And then he says, we will be caught up together with who? With them. He offers them comfort from their sorrow by reminding them that they will see their loved ones again. And can you imagine the excitement of hearing this for the first time? One minute you're like, oh, what's happened to my loved ones? I'm never going to see them again. Where are they? Paul comes along and tells you, yeah, I'm going to see them again. Can you imagine the comfort that would have brought to those who are left behind? I mean, what a relief, what a hope. And we're living in times now where people love reunions, don't they? Family reunions. Personally, I dread family reunions and high school reunions and all this stuff. It's not for me, okay? But I understand that people love doing this thing, get the whole family together. They even fly them in from Australia and things and bring them all together as one big family, and they meet long lost relatives they haven't seen for years, uncles and aunts, meet the children that they've never met before, and it's all great stuff. It's a joyous occasion, and it's a family reunion. But when Christians die and go to heaven, not only to be with Jesus, but to see their loved ones again who've gone before, isn't that one of the most incredible, greatest family reunions you could ever imagine? That's way more exciting than our physical reunions. In other words, when a loved one who is a Christian dies, Christians never have to say goodbye. Did you know that? We don't have to say goodbye. What we have to say is, I'll see you later. What difference that makes? You know, some people often say, oh, I'm so sorry for your loss. In fact, I was speaking to Patrick last night, and this is one thing I picked up from Patrick when he lost his wife many, many years ago. and people were saying to him, I'm sorry for your loss, and he would just smile. And he's like, what are you talking about? I haven't lost anything. I know exactly where she is. See, we don't lose people who are Christians. We know what they are. They're in heaven. And one day, Lord willing, we'll meet them again. Let me put it across this way. When you look at a tapestry, the backside of a woven tapestry, I mean, it just looks chaotic, doesn't it? It's just a tangled mess of threads. There are knots everywhere. There are colours that are clashing. There seems to be no design or no purpose. And that's what it's like often with grief here on earth. It's confusing. It's scattered. And it's painful on the underside. But when you turn that same thing over, you see a masterpiece. You see a masterpiece of breathtaking beauty as the threads that seem so random are perfectly woven together into this beautiful picture. And what I'm saying is this, loved ones. At death, when we get to heaven, is the moment that God turns the tapestry over. That's the moment where we get to see things for how they really are. We step back, we see the whole picture, and we understand how every single earthly heartache, every tear, every goodbye we've ever said was actually a part of the grand design. But that raises another question, doesn't it? And it's an uncomfortable question, and one I wrestled with. What if they're not a Christian? How can I be happy in heaven knowing that somebody I loved is in hell? That's a tough question, isn't it? You see, that question resonates with me and with many of you as well, possibly, because I've got family members who never accepted Christ. But let me go to a passage of scripture. We know this quite well. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain. All the other things have passed away. So John mentions here that God's going to wipe away every single tear from our eyes. No more death, mourning, or crying, or pain. But how is that possible? How can I not cry? How can I not feel pain knowing that my loved one is suffering somewhere else? How is that possible? Well, first of all, I don't believe this passage is speaking about heaven. This is personally speaking. I don't believe this passage is speaking about heaven. I believe, and we'll get to this when we start our Revelation studies on Wednesday, I believe that this is speaking about the Roman Empire, where the Christians were being slaughtered by the Roman Empire. And so when Rome and their allies were destroyed, there's no more pain, there's no more death, there's no more sorrow. Why? Because the people who were causing all of that had now been wiped out. The Roman Empire. And so with Rome and the rulers out of the road, there'll be no more crying, there'll be no more pain, there'll be no more tears. That's what I believe this is speaking about. Now, could we apply this to heaven? Absolutely. And I've got no issue with it. I've got no issue with it. But the question remains, how, in any shape or form, can I not cry or mourn when I know I've got loved ones who are in hell? Well, we know that God's ways are not our ways. We know his thoughts are not our thoughts, and his judgments are way beyond our comprehension. But like so many other questions, the simple answer is we don't know. We just don't know. I don't know how I'm going to be happy in heaven knowing my parents are somewhere else. I don't know how that's going to work. But I do believe that when Christians die, they will be fully aware of where they are and why they're there. And I do believe that those who end up in hell will be fully aware of where they are and why they are there. And so both parties are going to be fully aware of how they lived on earth and why they end up where they are. Imagine a loving father. He begins to cry in a courtroom. He's watching his son being legally convicted for some serious crime. When the verdict is being read out, his father recognizes that the judge's verdict is fair, it's correct, and it's necessary. Well, maybe in some strange way, everyone will be fully aware of God's justice, His holiness, His truth, and His wisdom. And maybe we should be like Abraham, who says, will not the judge of all the earth do what is right? Maybe that's the answer. Simply trust God in all of this. Maybe we'll finally understand just how holy God is and how sinful we are. Maybe, and notice I'm using the word maybe, okay? Maybe, when Jesus said, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted, maybe that will carry on when we get to the situation when we're in heaven and they're lost. I don't know. Maybe we should ask the question, if God is happy when anybody chooses to reject Him, obey and disobey the gospel, is God happy with that? Notice, they will be punished with everlasting destruction and shut out from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of His might. That's what hell is. The ultimate description of hell is shut out from the presence of the Lord. But you think God's happy with that? Notice, and surely, as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but rather that they would turn from their ways and live. Turn from your evil ways. Will you die, people of Israel? So, if we're asking the question, does God get any kind of enjoyment out of watching people go? The answer is no. The answer is no. We know, 1 Timothy 2, 2 Peter 3, that God longs, and I mean longs, for everybody to repent and come to Him. And so although we couldn't really fully answer the question concerning being happy in heaven whilst our loved ones are in hell, maybe that should make us a little bit bolder when we're speaking to our loved ones while they're still alive. Maybe that should give us the courage to speak to people who are like, well, I don't know, because they might, whatever. Maybe that should give us the courage to go forward. Charles Spurgeon once said, if sinners be damned, at least let them be damned over our dead bodies. He said, and if they perish, let them perish with their arms wrapped around their knees, imploring them to stay. In other words, what he's saying is, if you truly believe that heaven is real, and you truly believe that hell is real, then you're going to move heaven and earth to help them get there, because you're convicted of it. So, instead of trying to solve all the answers to some questions that are really difficult, maybe we should just focus our time in telling people about Jesus while they're still with us. And I know from personal experience, I find no joy, none, knowing that my parents are lost forever because they refuse to accept Jesus. It hurts. I mean, it really hurts. But it gives me a little comfort to know that Fumi and I went to visit my parents to talk to them about Jesus. and we deliberately went out of our way to talk to them about Jesus and his offer of eternal life, that they refused to accept it. They refused to accept Jesus, but at least we gave them a chance. We gave them a chance to accept or reject him. And do you know why part of the motivation for me going is because I think it would have been too overwhelming for me on a personal level for them to have died without me actually telling them about the one I've been proclaiming about for the last 13 years. I think the pain would have been a lot worse. A lot worse. Having that on my conscience. So they chose to reject him. That was their choice. And we, just like God, we have to honour and accept their choice. God has never forced any of us to follow him. He never forces anybody to follow him, even if that means that we would choose hell. So let me leave you with the words of C.S. Lewis. There are only two kinds of people in the end. Those who say to God, thy will be done, and those for whom God says in the end, thy will be done. God bless.